Good evening and welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me tonight, as usual, is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, I have a shocker of a question. Is it God's will for peace in the Middle East at this time?
John, when we consider such a question, I think most people, especially Christians, would automatically assume that God's will is always peace under any conditions, and we're going to maintain that that's not the case. And we're going to consider the current conflict that we see portrayed constantly on the television, Israel's incursion into Gaza. Israel is currently engaged in open warfare there against the Hamas organization. Hamas is an Islamic terrorist organization that exists for the sole purpose of the destruction of the state of Israel. Hamas is sponsored by Iran. The leader of Iran, Ahmadinejad, has repeatedly called for Israel to be wiped off of the face of the earth. And Hamas is the surrogate army for Iran that's located in Gaza that exists for this purpose. They also have a surrogate army in Lebanon, Hezbollah, that exists for exactly the same reason. Now, over the past couple of years, Hamas has terrorized the southern portions of the state of Israel by firing literally thousands of missiles into that area. And finally, I think Israelis have said, the leadership of Israel has said, enough, we're going to bring a halt to this thing and deal with it. John, I know this whole situation in Gaza is relative to an evacuation that took place there a couple of years ago.
Well, it's about 3 years. There were over 10,000 Jewish people, farmers, who made the desert blossom as a rose. Hills that were just beach sand became fertile under the blessing of God with these Jewish people in Gaza. And so Israel, as a gesture towards peace, they never admitted that Gaza wasn't Jewish territory, but they forcibly removed these 10,000 people and destroyed their homes and moved them out of Gaza, so there wasn't one Jew left in Gaza. And so what was the Arab response to this great act of peacemaking, Ken? The response was they moved the rocket launchers closer to Israeli cities so they could more easily hit their targets.
And now they're in range of major
and they have bigger rockets
centers
now,
right,
as the Iranians perfect longer range missiles. They're being smuggled in through the Egyptian border, and they have longer range missiles. They're closer to the civilian population. Goodwill gestures was seen as weakness on the Israeli government and not a peace gesture.
Absolutely. Now, as always, whenever Israel advances in a situation like this, the world, the United Nations and the nations of the world in general began to cry out for Israel to stop as soon as it appears as if they may be victorious. And unfortunately, and this is the issue that we're really trying to speak to today, many Christians join that course, again, based on the premise that it's always God's will somehow to have
right.
peace. And we would maintain something else.
Yeah, we've learned just from wars with just the nature of war, unless there's a victory, a decisive victory, then you're just postponing the war for another day. So the nations of the world have always kept Israel from victory.
Or attempted to.
Yes, from total victory. That would put an end to the wars, Ken.
Okay, now what are we going to investigate? We're going to look at, is it God's will for peace. And we're looking specifically at this present situation, and we're going to see if we can define that conflict in God's will. We're going to start by looking at it in a broader sense in the general Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We want to consider the Palestinian claim to the land to answer the question, is there a valid Palestinian claim to the land? And if you look at things from a purely humanitarian perspective, you would find that there is some truth to their claim. There has been some Arab families living in the midst of the land of Israel for centuries, I suppose.
Right. We have archaeologists, from England and from America that have been there, had gone in the 1830s, and they, in their writings, Robinson and Wilson describe what their findings were and the population and things like that. Then after that, in the 1860s and 70s, was Mark Twain went through there and said he went days without seeing anyone, a few Arabs here, a few Jews here in the city. And finally, Joan Peters, a British scholar, did research. Actually, she wasn't pro-Israel or anything. She did real research and found that the Palestinians weren't there from time immemorial, and that's how she named the book.
Or at least not large Palestinian Palestine.
That's right. So that's what Ken was saying. There were some there. So from a humanitarian point of view, there were some Arabs in the land.
Okay, now what we want to focus on, however, even though in the West and in the media in general, it's always the ancient Palestinian claim to the land, but from a Palestinian perspective, in their own journals and so on, there's a completely different claim set forth to the land, and that is an Islamic claim based on Islam. Now, Islam, the nature of Islam is in the pursuit of jihad. The vision is encompassing, subduing the whole world under Islamic control. And so once a territory has been claimed by Islam or conquered by Islam, it's considered to be a part of the territory of Islam, referred to as Dar al-Islam. And the area that remains to be conquered is the area of war. That's Dar al-Harb. That's how it's referred to.
I believe we have a map of this, Ken. To show.
Kind of portraying the whole Middle East, and the areas in red are the areas already conquered by Islam. Now, the area of the land of Israel was the first area outside the Arabian Peninsula that was overrun by Islam in 635 AD. And so we have now the modern state of Israel right square in the heart. You can hardly see it on the map. It's so small compared to the vast areas controlled by Islam. So you can see how desperate the Muslim people are for a little additional land. You could put the state of Israel in Lake Michigan 4 times, I understand, or for us from Florida, you could put it in this. I think from the area of in the south, from Orlando to Jacksonville in the north, and from the St. John's to the ocean, is about the same territory as the state of Israel. So you can see for this how desperate the Muslims are for land. That's not an issue. The plight of the Palestinians is not an issue. The issue is that this is in the very heart of Dar al-Islam. It has, from their perspective, it has become a part of the area already under Muslim control. Now, since the modern Jewish state has been established there, it is under, from their perspective, an alien control, and that can't stand.
The Quran indicates that God replaced the Jewish people with the Christians, then he replaced the Christians with the Muslims. So how could there be a sovereign Jewish state arising right in the middle of the Muslim nation? As a result of this religious claim that you don't hear in the press, no compromise is possible with Muslim groups. Serious Muslims are opposed to any peace plan. They give lip service, but they're opposed to any peace plan. And think of this. If the Saudi Arabians are proposing a peace plan, could it possibly be fair to Israel? Absolutely not. We know their history, and
again, because of this religious thing, no compromise is possible. It's just out of the question, and that's the reason that we hear Ahmadinejad making repeated cries to utterly wipe Israel off the face of the
earth. And it is a ruse to take the pressure off of their lousy, inefficient government, which even with oil revenues, people are having a very hard time.
Absolutely.
So this is point to something else.
We want to change the perspective slightly now and look at the Jewish claim for the land and ask the question: is there a valid Jewish claim to the land? And if we did so, we'll go back 4,000 years, actually, to the time of Abraham. And again, as John was pointing a few moments ago, in the last 100 years or so, there has been archaeological finds over and over and over again validating the very ancient Jewish association with the land.
They're in Hebrew, not in Arabic, from ancient times, number one. The second thing is that as the Jewish people started to return to Israel, as God said, I will bring you back, as they started to return, the Arabs started to return at the same time.
Well, there were jobs available.
Jobs available, and they paid better than their Arab brothers paid.
Well, we're talking about a time when lifestyle is different than now, and any kind of income was basically survival. And so the Jewish people were building infrastructure and it provided jobs. So
now we want to look at the thing so we have a humanitarian view of Arabs in the land, Jews in the land, and then the great influx of Jews.
So you can look at it either way. You can make an argument for a Palestinian claim. You can make an argument from a humanitarian standpoint for a Jewish claim.
Right. Now this isn't northern New York or Seattle or something. This is the land of Israel that God speaks about, and we have to look at it differently from that point of view. If we are believers, we want to look at it from God's point of view, and we know that ancient Hebrew prophets all spoke about God returning the Jewish people back to Israel, Ken, and the regathering of the Jews.
Okay, so we want to cite a couple of scriptures in particular. Jeremiah is a prophet to the nations and is particularly relevant here. And if John would read from Jeremiah 16, he has a specific statement which is repeated virtually from every Hebrew prophet, actually, concerning the ingathering.
Starting in verse 14, therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the countries where he banished them, for I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. So God is saying, and it happened, and it's still happening, that he's going to do something more supernatural, more outstanding than the actual exodus from Egypt, the regathering of the Jewish people in our day.
Okay, how do we know this is God? Did Jeremiah say anything along that line that would indicate that this is really the hand of God?
Okay, so let's look at Jeremiah 31:10. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare it in the coastlands afar off, and say, he who scattered Israel will regather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. For the Lord has ransomed Jacob and redeemed him from the hand of him who was stronger than he.
So God specifically said, and Jeremiah is the prophet that stood by and prophesied at the time that Israel was dispersed from the land, and he declared that only God himself would ingather or regather the people to the land. And so we would maintain today that this ingathering is very, very much a part of God's will. God initiated it over 100 years ago. It's been a continual development since that time, and the Jewish presence in the land and strength has grown all through that era. And we believe that God's hand and blessing is upon him for his purpose. Now, in order to understand his purpose, we also have to look at other prophets, and there is a clear prophetic picture here. We want to look specifically at the promises God spoke through the prophet Joel chapter 3. John, if you would pick up that scripture, please.
For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land.
I'm particularly sensitive to that portion where it's talking about dividing up the land, because God says, I'm going to enter into judgment with the nations for this, and this has been the policy of the United States throughout the modern history of Israel, is to divide the land of Israel. They call it now the roadmap, and it was this plan and that plan,
Yeah,
but
the Oslo Accords.
Always the plan is the same, divide up the land, and the Bible speaks expressly about that. The prophet Zechariah spoke also concerning this day, of this time of the ingathering, and maybe John will read that one, and we'll talk about that.
Okay, Zechariah 12, I'll read verses 2 and 3. Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around, and when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. And it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. So we could see something like that forming now. All the nations are crying out, condemning Israel.
It's in the process, and we've made studies about, for example, UN resolutions, and as I understand it, over half of UN resolutions during the history of the United Nations has been against Israel.
Now, imagine that. There are, 200 nations, 150-something nations in the world. Israel's this tiny sliver of people, 6 million Jews out of,
We say 1/10 of 1% of the world population.
Over half of every resolution passed by the United Nations have been against Israel.
Boy, these Israelis...
That ought to tell you something.
These Israelis must be real low-down people to get that kind of attention. Listen, there is rebellion. The Bible reveals that there is rebellion in mankind, has been since the garden. Now, part of the establishment of the kingdom of God and coming to a climax of history with the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, Christians look for Jesus to return. Leading up to that return will be coming together, pulling together of that rebellion, something that would precipitate that rebellion in mankind, and I believe we're seeing that take place even as we speak in this Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Now, let me add, John. It is not God that's causing the rebellion. The rebellion is in the heart of man. God is acting to pull that together and precipitate it in order to deal with it one final time.
Okay. So God intends to do something in the midst of Israel, a blessing to come to the whole world, but first he's prodding the nations to act overtly against what he's doing by blessing Israel.
There's a misconception that the Armageddon means the end of the world. It doesn't mean the end of the world. Armageddon is God's plan that we've been talking about to precipitate rebellion, and the rebellion of man is the thing that's coming to the end, not mankind. Armageddon leads to deliverance and God's kingdom established on the world. And that's the end product. That's what Jesus was preaching in the kingdom of God, and that's the end that we're approaching.
And let me say, the most likely way that this is happening, as we see it unfold before us, is the Palestinian people. They are at the forefront of opposing the will of God. We read from a lot of prophets that God is bringing back his people. There's a people claiming the same land to keep God's people out of there, and the whole world is saying, divide the land so that these foreigners may live in the land. And the Palestinians are foreigners, and so that's the struggle going on, because they see Israel right in the middle of Dar al-Islam.
And here is our exhortation, especially to Christians today. We must learn to look at things from a biblical or God's viewpoint and not a humanitarian standpoint. The media, all aspects of media, government, whatever, is going to be looking at things from a humanitarian standpoint, and we believe that as the Israelis, and they are assuming a more and more biblical position. We're in contact with a lot of Israelis that have a bold faith, full of biblical faith, and the more they assume a biblical position, we believe the more God's blessing is going to be upon them, and the so-called plight of the Palestinians can only worsen.
Get worse.
And so the humanitarian cry is going to be loud.
Right. And the humanitarian cry, if you're really interested in the Palestinian people, only God's peace plan will work. He says this in Isaiah, that no weapon formed against you, meaning Israel, shall prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment will be condemned. Now that's God is a Zionist. I don't know how to put it any other way, Ken, but God is a Zionist. He said, I will bless them that bless you and curse them that curse you. He said it to Abraham in Genesis 12. He said it to all Israel in Numbers 24, Ken.
John, I want to take things a step further than you have. By saying that God is a Zionist, we might assume that means that God agrees with the Zionist position. God initiated the Zionist position.
Okay, all right.
It is He. That's what we read from Jeremiah. It is He who gathered. It is God that initiated this thing that's taken place before us, and it's His blessing. We look at the difference in casualties in Gaza, something like 800. And all kinds of different, we don't know how many fighters.
We can't trust those figures.
We don't know, but literally hundreds of Hamas fighters have died. And to date, at this point, I believe it's about 10 Israelis have died. I don't know, 10 soldiers, I guess 10 soldiers. So let's just say 800 to 10. That's 80 to 1. Almost 100 to 1 proportions in fatalities in that regard. Now, the Hamas people are well equipped. We're not talking about people with primitive weapons here. They got the best weapons Iran can ship in there.
And they've dug tunnels. They spring out of places trying to capture Israeli soldiers, to have more hostages to kill and to mutilate. And, well, this is what's happening. Now, is something behind this, Ken? What's God doing?
Again, we believe that God has initiated this whole thing, and therefore we do not believe it's God's will just for everybody to lay down their weapons and go back to receiving rockets every day. It's God's will that the Jewish people in the land of Israel prosper and grow and take possession of the land. The Bible is very, very clear. We call them the gatekeepers, taking over the area of the gateway, the area around Jerusalem. And as they do so, the humanitarian aspect of this thing is going to grow more severe. But from a righteous standpoint, it's blessing.
Right. This is God's plan of redemption. If we are looking for redemption of mankind and the reign of Messiah in the earth, this is the way it's going to come. It's not going to come by compromise. It's going to come, God's bringing all the people down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. He's going to enter into judgment there. Look at what he said. This is in Joshua. I'm in Joshua 11. I want to read verses 19 and 20. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon, and they took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might have received no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord commanded Moses.
So we believe today that God indeed is hardening the heart. I use when we look at the word hardening the heart, it literally means making them foolishly aggressive. And the opposition to what God is doing has become foolishly aggressive, which will lead to their destruction.
There's a cry out. The AP, we call it the Arab press, is in Gaza, and they film every death, every child's death. They're going to feed dead children to
pictures
killing themselves if they have to show the cruelty of Israel, to appeal to the sympathy of the world against this evil Zionist plot. So this is still yet to come. It's going to get worse and worse. Those that oppose God are going to find pain and suffering. Those that are on the same wavelength, obedient to God, blessing will overcome them.
Okay, so our challenge is to look at things and put our strength to things that are in God's will, and not just respond to humanitarian appeals. Our group, our congregation, has worked for a number of years in various communities in the heartland of Israel, currently at a community called Kedemim. Many of you, we've purposely solicited contributions to help in that work, and we need about $9,000 before next March, because we're going to build again. We want to invite you to help by sending in contributions to that cause. And I particularly want to thank the folks that have already sent in contributions, and assure you that that money will be used for the upbuilding of these communities in Judea and Samaria. And then John is taking a group up actually only in a couple of months.
March 8th. We're leaving here and going up to Israel for 2 weeks. Give me a call if you have your passport and money, and you can come with us. Listen, God wants to see. You don't want to find yourself in an agreement with the nations that are going to oppose the will of God. Come with us and see what God is doing today. Well, that's our program for this evening. Shalom.